You are watching GrassRoots Television, serving the Roaring Fork Valley since 1971.
Is our only home, so treat her with love, with love. We won't be here long, so don't try and hold on to something that belongs to our daughters and sons. Everybody.
All right. Hi everyone, my name is Olivia and welcome to ACES. Tonight is our first Naturalist night and we're pretty excited about it. It's a lecture series put on by partnership with ACES and the Wilderness Workshop. And Dave is here from Wilderness Workshop and has some materials if you guys want to stop after the presentation and pick them up. Also, our sponsors tonight are Kelly Hart of Mountain Life Baking, Choice Teas, and Celestial Seasonings. Also, just a brief mention, next week's presentation will be by Will Rausch and is called Rising Tree Lines, Ecological and Topographical Influences on Tree Establishment in British Columbia. So that's a pretty cool project. He's comparing historical images of tree line to some of his current field observations and seeing how tree line has changed over the years. So on to the main event. Tonight we have David Havlick. He co-founded the Wild Rockies Field Institute, which is a really innovative school offering real-life outdoor learning experiences. It's pretty cool. David attended Dartmouth as an undergrad and then got a master's in environmental studies from the University of Montana. He also has a PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Currently, he is a professor of geography and environmental studies at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. So tonight he will be discussing topics from his book, No Trace Distant. So if you guys could give David a round.
Thanks, Olivia. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out, and thank you to Wilderness Workshop and ACES both for inviting me to come over to Aspen and Carbondale. It's been about 15, I grew up in Colorado, but it's been about 15 years since I've been in the Roaring Fork Valley, and it's been nice to come back and see some of the powder I've been missing all these years. It's not like this in North Carolina. The topic I want to focus on tonight is, I think, probably both familiar to all of you at some level, roads. You know, we see them every day, and I think most of us are familiar with motorized recreation as it's sort of becoming more and more common in the form of off-road vehicles in particular. All-terrain vehicles and snowmobiles are really the two kinds of off-road vehicles that I'll be focusing on. But I'm hoping that I can cast these issues into some perspectives that will also get us to think a little bit differently about them and maybe pose some broader questions about not just these issues, but also public lands generally, the national forests, national parks, Bureau of Land Management lands, and to a lesser extent, national wildlife refuges that are really deeply influenced by roads and motorized recreation. One of the points I want to make clear from the outset is that I don't think all roads are bad, and I recognize that I, like probably most all of us here, are deeply dependent upon roads for a whole array of things, whether it's driving in the mountains to look at the fall colors, or accessing a trailhead to go hiking or mountain biking, or simply going shopping or driving to work. Actually, I bike to work, but anyways, I recognize there's a whole array of uses for roads. And certainly, thinking back to sort of my childhood and how I came to be interested in public lands issues and conservation, I'm certain that the summer trips that I did with my family in our car on roads, going to places like Mesa Verde and other national parks, made a real impact on me and made me more interested in these places and had an influence that I haven't yet been able to shake, probably. So that said, I also want us to think critically about roads and motorized recreation, and not just to accept that, oh, they're out there, they must be good, or we must have to sort of accept them as they are. There also, I think, are roads that bring us to places that we probably shouldn't be able to drive to, and sort of case like this where you go there and you drive down a road like this, and you can't help but marvel at the engineering prowess or sort of the bravado of putting a road in a place like this. But certainly, whether it's for safety issues or erosion issues, I think we can look at roads like this and think maybe something should have been done differently at some point in terms of providing access to a place like this. Before I get going too far in, I want to signal that there's probably three main points that I'll work through in this talk, and I might as well foreground them right away so that you can find them as I'm going, and they won't be a mystery when I say, did you get the three main points out of the talk? And the first is simply that there's a vast network of roads on our public lands, and that may or may not be a surprise to you, but there are about 650,000 miles of roads that crisscross our public lands. Just by way of comparison, there are about 43,000 miles in our national interstate highway system. So vastly more roads on our public lands than on the highways that we're most familiar with, probably. On the national forests alone, there are about 440,000 miles, so more than 10 times the length of the interstate highway system. And these roads come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, basically. And so I'll try to illustrate that as I go. The second key point that I'm hoping to register with you all is that there's a new breed of vehicles that really has just emerged in the last 20 or 30 years, the ATVs and the snowmobiles that I mentioned earlier, that by virtue of sort of improving technologies, lighter materials, and more powerful engines, can now go to places where we never saw them a couple decades ago. So there's this expansion and this proliferation, more and more numbers of more and more kinds of vehicles that essentially extend the reach of roads. So we see a more thoroughly motorized array of public lands than we ever have before. And then the third point that I want to sort of close with as I move along is to try to encourage us all to not become complacent with roads or motorized vehicles, and to be really cognizant that we face choices with these things, that we don't just need to accept that, there are 600,000 miles of roads and there's nothing we can do about it. There are, in fact, things we can do about it. So just to get back to that point about how roads come in all shapes and sizes, this is how a number of roads actually start on national forest lands, just somebody driving through an open area. And you can see there's sort of a light two-track, and then with more and more use over time, we see the sort of familiar two-track ruts that I'm sure probably most all of you have encountered at various points in your travels through the national forest. A lot of these roads and a lot of the roads on national forests are unplanned. These are called user-created routes, or some people call them ghost roads because they tend not to show up on agency inventories or agency maps, but we all know they're out there. The Forest Service itself has identified or has sort of acknowledged about 60,000 miles of these user-created routes where they were never planned as part of a systematic process to create an access system. They just were developed by people traipsing through the open areas. And this this phenomenon has become only more common as off-road vehicles, and ATVs in particular, have proliferated. There are, of course, highly developed road systems as well. And these are the roads that we're most likely to drive. A lot of the user-created routes, and even a lot of these built roads, over time become less, if they're not sort of continually used, they become obsolete and actually impassable. So from the work I've done in the Northern Rockies, at least probably half of the roads, the road mileage up there isn't really even accessible in terms of driving a vehicle on. I spent about 6 or 7 years doing road inventories in the Northern Rockies and just trying to identify how many miles were on the ground in grizzly bear habitat in particular, and found that a lot of the roads you couldn't drive on. It was hard even to mountain bike and navigate, and in some cases it was difficult even to walk because these roads have become overgrown. But what we found, and what I'll try to highlight as I go on, is that these roads that, even that they're essentially abandoned or ignored, we can't afford to forget about them because they continue to cause ecological problems. The planned roads, which really are the majority of the roads in the National Forest system were planned, and the majority of them were planned for just this kind of purpose, for the extraction of timber. And you can see how where we find clear cuts, you almost always find roads because they needed roads to haul the trees to market. And if you look at the very center of the picture where there's kind of the stripes coming down, those are skid trails or places where they've hauled logs up to landing platforms to get them out. And in some cases, the agency or the logging companies actually developed they improved the skid trails so they had essentially had a road bed or contributed to the mileage in the road network, so much so that the road density, the amount of miles of road per square mile of land, became extraordinarily high. So if we imagine that this is 1 square mile, that image up there, a mile on each side, if we had a road density of 1 mile per square mile, it would just be a straight line from side to side. In this picture, we might estimate there's probably 3 to 5 miles per square mile, I would guess. There's places in national forests where the logging was done really intensively, and these JAMA roads, they're called, were put in, where the road density comes up to as high as 40 or 50 or even 60 miles per square mile. So just imagine trying to fit that many roads in that square mile patch, and at some level you can't help but marvel at the ingenuity of people to get that many roads in a given place. But on the other hand, what we're seeing is that it causes all kinds of ecological problems, in particular watershed problems. So it destabilizes the slopes that then tend to collapse and slide into fish-bearing streams. And in places like central Idaho, Clearwater National Forest has developed a real assertive program of road removal because they're recognizing that road failures are actually contributing to the decline of salmon runs and trout populations in the interior of Idaho. And I'll talk more about some of the other effects of roads as I go along. Even relatively simple roads, this is probably a road that was just bladed in to some kind of sagebrush country. That surface, even these simple roads can have real problems with runoff and erosion, so that the surface flow the road wasn't built in a way to handle the erosive pressure of that surface runoff, and you can see the gully grew bigger and bigger to the point where the road is basically unusable. So one example of the kind of roads we're talking about where they're not providing any use on the ground, but they actually are causing damage to the system that they're running through. Same kind of issue with more fully developed. This was a former system road from the Boise National Forest in Idaho, and you can see the culvert, that metal pipe in the middle. What we found with road failures is that more often than not, they tend to center around culvert problems or these drainage problems. So if those culverts aren't properly maintained, they tend to get clogged with debris. Sometimes they're just built so they're not large enough to handle the pressure that comes through. The water gets channelized and needs to go somewhere. More often than not, especially in granitic or sandy soils, it'll saturate the soil around that roadbed and destabilize it, and it will collapse. Just another example, this is from Washington State. The whole sort of science of roads and road ecology and the problems that come with roads has evolved over time. And one of the places where it's been a real living laboratory for understanding what happens with roads is actually in Redwoods National Park. And I've got a couple shots from Redwoods. I was talking with Connie Harvey earlier this morning about how she was instrumental in helping to get Redwoods set aside, so there's some interesting sort of connections here, perhaps. But in Redwoods, the initial park was set aside in the 60s, and then in 1978, Congress annexed a bunch of land to the park, and those annexed lands actually included hundreds of miles of logging roads in areas that had been logged of the old-growth redwood forests. And part of Congress's intention was to add to these lands to try to help protect, over the long term, the integrity of Redwood Creek and the watershed at the center of the park. They recognized that they had created too small a park initially, and that they weren't sort of responding to the topographic and geographic needs of the place. And so park officials, basically as soon as they got these new lands in 1978, began a concerted effort to try and figure out what to do to restore or remove these roads from causing problems to the watershed. And initially they tried some fairly modest things. They built these sort of ornate wooden check dams in streams, thinking they would slow down the movement of surface water. And they found time and again that their efforts were failing. And much to their surprise, even roads, this one is less clear, but I think this image shows it better. Even roads that were revegetating quite nicely still were failing. So you can see this is a landslide that actually, you can just barely see a roadbed at the top, and the rest of it you can see it's just sort of an alder stand. So the alders were the sort of primary succession trees that came in. These alders in many places were 20 or 30 feet tall. Looks like a healthy sort of regenerating forest. And yet the road became saturated in a heavy rain and still gave out, and all the alders that were on that roadbed still basically went with the loose soil. And this one in a number of the slides, this was from December of 1996, actually came all the way down to fish-bearing streams, clogged the streams, smothering spawning beds, the whole bit. And it helped highlight, I think, for redwood officials that they needed to take a more aggressive approach to treating the roads. And what they ended up doing was bringing in the same kinds of equipment that they'd used to build the roads in the first place to remove the roads. And I'll get to that more later, but I wanted to bring this image out earlier in the talk just to illustrate how we got to realize that even revegetating, seemingly repairing roads still create liabilities in the forest system. And actually in the last 10 years, there's been similar widespread rounds of road failures after heavy rains throughout the Intermountain West in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, sort of throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. What I've been talking about so far are really just effects that are caused by the presence of roads. So we can think of those as existence effects or presence effects. Simply by our roads being out there, they create an array of ecological issues, whether it's the prospect for road failure and increased sedimentation. They create corridors that change the light and the temperature characteristics in formerly intact forest blocks. One of the other things they do, though, is invite use. So there's an array of use effects then, too. So there's sort of two broad categories of impacts that roads generate. And that use effects is the link then that I see, or that I've found in my work between roads and then motorized recreation, because whenever there's a road corridor, it seems to invite use. When people who have ATVs or snowmobiles in particular drive along sort of quiet road systems or road systems, whenever they see that open corridor, it sort of invites sort of that adventuring spirit, I suppose, where it seems to encourage them to go. And certainly there are an array of users who abide by restrictions and don't go where they're not supposed to, but invariably there seem to be people who are also willing to just, who want to explore those road corridors. So land managers have been trying for a number of years now to figure out ways to prevent that kind of use. And road closures come about for a variety of reasons, whether it's to protect wildlife or to reduce erosion or disturbance. You can see on the sign some of the reasons. There also are certainly user conflicts, so places that have been traditionally not used by motorized vehicles, land managers often try to preserve the character of those places. But what we found almost invariably is that road closures haven't been very effective. When I was doing road inventories in the 90s, along with sort of measuring the road density, we also checked or assessed the effectiveness of road closures. And in 5 years of doing this, we inventoried more than 800 closure points. And of those, mostly gates, we found that in more than half of the closure sites, there was some evidence of motorized use beyond that closure point. And even here you can see there's room around the sides of that gate for someone in an ATV to drive if they so choose. And similarly here, you can see the sort of disturbed soil on the right-hand side where people have circumvented the gate. Effort to sort of extend the barrier and put in a series of posts, and again through the middle you can see there's still a motorized track. A sort of dirt bike trail or ATV trails going to the left of that. So what we found is that signage and even gates and some form of obstacle consistently don't measure up in terms of providing adequate closure. So that's been one sort of chronic issue with that extends, in a sense, the motorization of even closed road systems by virtue of these new machines that are out there. Of course, they're off-road vehicles, so they don't even need roads, right, to go where they go. And there are also a whole suite of effects, in open country, creating roads and ruts that cause all kinds of ecological impacts in desert lands. And even in places where you might not think of off-road vehicles being a real problem, we've seen some widespread cases of abuse. So this is in the Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida, which over the years has received and sort of seen the development of hundreds of miles of these user-created routes. And just in the last couple of years, finally, the Park Service approved a new plan to close off these routes and try to restore them to limit much more severely the access of bog buggies or ATVs that go through these places. So we are seeing some renewed or some sort of heightened awareness by land managers that they need to address these problems, but it continues to be a challenge to figure out just how they can limit the extent of the vehicles. Even in the Rockies, in places like, this is on the Gallatin National Forest outside of Yellowstone National Park, even in forested areas and in trail systems, oftentimes we find that the trails are wide enough or there's a generous enough corridor for the 50-inch wide ATVs to get into. And in some cases, the ORV user groups have worked collaboratively with state recreation agencies to do trail improvement, what they call trail improvement, to widen the trails so they actually can accommodate more easily the vehicles. And the interesting thing there is that I think actually Wilderness Workshop has some literature that talks about troads, sort of this hybrid between a trail and a road. So this, on the map, this shows up just as a trail. And when you go, I actually was leading a group of students with the Wild Rockies Field Institute on this backpacking course, and I think we've been hiking for about 4 or 5 days, and we came over a ridge and dropped down and encountered this camp that had been set up by a fleet of about 5 or 6 ATVers. And the effect for us was that it seemed as if we'd entered a roaded area, just because the motorized vehicles were there, the tracks were there, the width was such that it felt like we were walking down a road, and it very much transformed the kind of experience we were having in that place beyond what the map or sort of our expectations had led us to suggest it would be like. So this, I think, is one way of highlighting what's become one of the most glaring effects, I think, of this whole surge in motorized recreation, and that's user conflicts, or these social impacts that these machines generate, where we have a sort of increasing array of uses competing for the same chunks of land or the same space. And what studies have found, and I think what probably most of our common experiences have found, is that when you go in as a non-motorized recreationist, whether it's by foot or by ski or by horseback, and you encounter motorized use, it tends to displace the quiet use or the non-motorized users, and they go somewhere else where they think that they won't find the motorized use. So there's something of an asymmetry of experience where we are walking through seem to have very little impact on this ATV group of campers. If anything, I think they were a little surprised that we didn't wave more enthusiastically or greet them more heartily. And I think there actually is some form of surprise. I often hear ATVers talking about how hikers or backpackers just don't know how to share. And so I think there is sort of this puzzlement almost on their behalf where they wonder why they're willing to share with the non-motorized users, but it doesn't go both ways. So I think that highlight, or that points to one of the sources of conflict between these kinds of use groups. In places like Yellowstone National Park, where we can talk more about the ongoing controversy and management issues there sort of during the question period if you'd like, but places like Yellowstone National Park, the onset of snowmobile use in this place has really transformed the character of the winter experience in the park, not just for the human visitor, but also for wildlife. When you go to Old Faithful or anywhere on the road system in Yellowstone in the winter, and it's virtually impossible to escape the sound and the smoke and the sight of snowmobilers going through. And it has also had a profound effect on wildlife like bison. Not so much encounters like this, but by virtue of the need to groom the roads so that snowmobiles can travel easily on there has made it easier for bison to leave the park. And then there's this whole sort of complex issue with brucellosis and the bison transmitting this disease potentially to cattle. And so the state of Montana has been shooting bison that leave the park. So it's a long story, but the upshot of it is sort of at the heart of it is grooming and snowmobile use, and snowcat use actually is part of it too. So it's not just the snowmobiles. But the experience in Yellowstone, what used to be the quiet season in Yellowstone, even as late as the 1970s or early 80s, is really now the noisy season. If you want to find peace and quiet in Yellowstone, you're better off going on 4th of July weekend and getting a half mile off the road than you are going skiing in December and trying to escape the sound of snowmobiles. So that I think, even in our nation's first national park, the world's first national park, we find this transforming effect by these machines. I want to sort of step back from the impacts and some of these issues to sort of pose a couple broader questions for us to think about then. The first is simply what we think we should be doing with our public lands. How should they be managed? So it really speaks to sort of a values question. What values and uses should we be managing these lands for, whether it's Yellowstone or the White River National Forest? How do we navigate through this complex and often conflicting set of uses to accommodate and privilege the uses that we think best fit the purposes of these lands? Another question that I think is worth considering is simply how many roads are enough? How much motorized use is enough? And I wish I had the map of Colorado or of the whole Rockies to put up, but this was the one I had, and it's of Montana, which is actually one of the states that has lower road density than many states. But it's, for me, when I look at that map, my first reaction isn't, geez, I wish we had more roads in Montana. It looks to me like there are a lot of roads already in this state, and in fact, it's incredibly difficult to get away from roads, whether you're in Montana or anywhere in the lower 48. The title of my book, No Place Distant, I sort of stumbled upon it when I realized how difficult it is to get far away from roads. And Dave has this of the White River Forest.
We did a similar exercise here for the White River National Forest. It's probably hard to see in this light, but it's a similar sort of thing. We call it our bloodshot eyeball map because the roads are in red and they look like veins, and that's Glenwood Springs and Aspen I-70. But the green indicates 1 mile away from a road. So you have to go to the flat tops, the Snowmass wilderness, basically the wilderness areas to get more than a couple miles away from the road.
Yeah. And so I think for many of us, it's shocking to realize how roaded our country, our landscapes have become. The place, the very southeast corner of Yellowstone National Park, the thoroughfare area, is actually the place in the lower 48 that's most distant from a road, and it's right about 20 miles. So it's really just a long day's walk for a fit hiker to get that distance, which for me at least is a fairly sobering thought. I think one of the brief aside, but the experience that first got me thinking about roads in a broader way was when, shortly after college, with a couple friends, I hiked the Continental Divide from Mexico to Canada for 6 months. And I think at the time I thought, oh, it'll be my frontier, experience. I'll go back to the hinterlands and see America how it was in, I don't know, 1800. I'll be Lewis and Clark. And the thing I was struck with, even in as early as New Mexico, was how many roads there were. And 4 miles north of the Mexico border, we crossed our first road, and it just kept going like that. And one of my buddy that I was hiking with, the first paved road we got to, he actually took off his boots. He was like, my boots won't touch asphalt the whole hike. And about 20 miles later, when we hit the next paved road, he realized this isn't going to work. But it wasn't until I really sort of, in a concerted way, tried to get away from roads that I realized how difficult it was to do that. So I think that was, again, sort of probably a useful experience for me to realize that I wasn't Lewis and Clark and needed to sort of wake up. But this is similar to the map that Dave just showed, actually. This is the 8 Rocky Mountain states. And you can see the legend. The green is greater than 4 miles from a road. And Colorado, it's a little indistinct, but this is actually the Uintas in Utah. So Colorado, I think this is Dinosaur and the Yampa River. So we really break off here or here. This is the Weminuche Wilderness. And you can see it's really, for most of Colorado, it's just a few small little patches where you can get as much as 4 miles from a road. And it's only in those biggest wilderness chunks that you can do that. The big cluster, it's also a little misleading. This is Salt Lake, right? So in the middle of Salt Lake, you can get away from a road, but it's not really what we think of when we think about roadless areas. The bigger chunks, keep walking back and forth, this is the Yellowstone ecosystem, and then that one farther north is the Bob Marshall complex, and then this is the River of No Return, Selway Bitterroot complex. So, and so I mentioned thoroughfare being 20 miles from the road. I think the second most distant place was, I think it was in the Bob, it was about 18 miles, and then in central Idaho it's about 16, and it really tails off steeply from there. So again, just emphasizing that point of how roaded our land has become. I pose those questions, sort of the values questions. How should we be managing our lands? And I actually, before I get into this, I want to try to provide a couple suggestions for how we might think about answering those questions or evaluating those questions too. And the first is the term access management, which for those of you who are land managers or know them, it's one of the things that our Forest Service officials and BLM officials are struggling with most actively today, and really for the past 10 years, it's been their biggest headache. I think if you ask most of them what their biggest problem is, often they'll say access management. And for me, the key part of that term is access. What do we mean by access? And if we mean we need to be able to drive to a place or to drive every place, then that creates a certain set of management priorities. But if it means simply that we ought to be able to go to a place, then I think it means something fairly different. And one area, one sort of category of areas that highlights that distinction, I think, is when we think about wilderness areas. People who fight against wilderness designations often sort of talk about we're going to be locked out of our lands, or these are our ways of sort of locking us out of our public lands. But when you think about it, or when I think about it, wilderness designations really don't prevent any of us from going into those places. They just mean that we have to leave our machines at the border, right? And for me, that is an important distinction in terms of access, whether it's access for people or access for machines. And I think depending on how we view that term, it leads to different kinds of management considerations and different priorities that we would want to see put forward. The second sort of broad way of trying to evaluate sort of how we should be managing our public lands, I think, is to look at roads. And the first question for me that comes up is it useful? Is it a useful road? Does it have some purpose that serves us? Because I don't know why we would choose to have roads if they're not serving us for something, right? And so when we look at the 440,000 miles of national forest roads, certainly if you you tried to find all those roads, you'd be hard-pressed to find them, let alone drive them or use them somehow. And yet, as I've mentioned, they're still causing problems. So it seems clear to me that, well, surely we have too many roads to be useful to us, and in fact, all these roads are actually causing considerable harm in many places. The third sort of way of trying to think these things through or evaluate them maybe is to look at the social and environmental relations that the roads and machines generate or promote. And so some of the questions I would ask sort of in that category would be, or might be, are there, how does a particular road affect our relationship to a given place? Do we enter into that place in a way that connects us to it or not? Is it bringing us sort of closer to understanding more about that place, or is it keeping us separated from that place? Or with motorized vehicles, how is the use of these vehicles influencing the relationship between the motorized users and other users, or motorized users and their environment? And is their relationship predominantly with the others that they encounter, whether it's people or wildlife, or is it predominantly with the machine itself? And I know when I was about 10 years old, I think my parents took us snowmobiling one time. They said, "This is the one time you're going to do this in your life," and it actually was the one time I've done it in my life. And I know for me that it was all about the machine when I was on that thing, and everything else was a blur. And so, granted, I have a limited exposure to what it's like to sort of be traveling through the landscape on an ATV or a snowmobile, but from the experience that I have had, it makes me question sort of what kinds of relationships it fosters. So again, and then also I talked about that sort of asymmetry of experience, and I think that's worth trying to consider. So those are sort of maybe some more abstract or sort of values-based questions that I encourage us to think about or to try to integrate as we talk about land management approaches. To get back to some more grounded approaches, and that third point that I highlighted from the outset about that there are some things we can do about these issues. One of the approaches, this is a group called the Sky Islands Alliance down in Arizona, and they've had a lot of success getting volunteers to come out and help close user-created routes or routes that have been popularized by ORVers in places where the land managers don't want them to be going. And so it's usually using hand tools or some handheld power tools like this auger. And basically what they do is here they're drilling holes to plant shrubs. They use pry bars and move rocks or boulders. And one of the goals is to try to obscure the entrance or that corridor to the road that I talked about that creates this invitation to use. And the folks that I know who have helped organize these outings and others who have participated, they end up really raving about the experience. It's this really satisfying kind of community building event where they go out and it's kind of like, maybe it's akin to weeding your garden. You can see right away the direct result of what you've done. And they find that there's people who come back time and again to participate in these kinds of projects. So, and for me, I think it's inspiring to see that a relative handful of people can go out and actually make a difference in the areas that they care about and that they know about. Another example, this was from a course that I taught up in the West Yellowstone area, just outside of Yellowstone Park. It was a course on restoration ecology, and we coordinated with the local Forest Service official, and she had identified a number of roads in this very flat area right near Pitkin Lake outside of West Yellowstone that she didn't want to keep on the land for a couple reasons. One was that they were out of compliance, so they had a higher road density than what they were supposed to have for grizzly bear habitat protection. And the other thing was that teenagers, I guess, from West Yellowstone were going down the road and partying and drinking beer or having sex, or I don't know what they were doing. But so it was sort of a project that brought together ecological objectives and family values objectives in this nice package. And so the Forest Service official had coordinated with this this heavy equipment operator, and he went through and really just ripped the road surface or decompacted it. And then we came, and he also knocked down a few trees to help obscure that, again, that corridor, that sort of invitation for use. And then we planted some trees in the shade of the downfall. And we worked for about 5 or 6 hours, and we were able to treat about 5 or 6 miles of road. So it was a pretty quick operation, and it felt, at the end of the day, we could look at, it was 3 different roads, I think, that we treated, and we could look and see, well, those roads don't show up anymore. And actually, I was able to go back for successive years, and one of the roads actually was sort of a failure. The teenagers were persistent, I guess. Family values lost or something. But for 2 of the 3 roads, they actually did regenerate and revegetate and remained closed. So again, it was a very educational experience for the students, and I think we all felt like we'd accomplished something. And it wasn't, it didn't take a lot of money, or it just took sort of coordination with the land manager to get it done. Much as I highlighted, there are different kinds of roads, there are also different kinds of road removal. This is the shots that I just showed of it was really just a ripping. It was flat, so there weren't hydrological issues or erosion issues. It was just a matter of getting that corridor obscured and regrowing. This is a similar treatment where it was really just a surface treatment where they decompacted the soil so grasses could grow. But you can see there's still a very visible road cut. So there still may well be some risk for road failure or hydrological disruption. What happens is, instead of water flowing beneath the surface and sort of moving gradually down a hillside, is when it hits that road cut, it converts to surface flow and it becomes more erosive. So if they haven't treated the culverts or some of the stream crossings, this could still cause problems over time. But at least, so it's actually one of the kinds of road treatments that works well in flat country, but not in steep terrain. And so in steep terrain, and this was really the lesson from Redwood National Park that I brought up earlier, what we found is that it's really important to go back in pretty aggressively, in some cases horrifically aggressively, and pull back the fill material, the stuff that was sort of used to create that bench, that nice flat surface for road. You pull that back with a backhoe and this heavy machinery to try to return the original contour of the slope, which then does accomplish that hydrologic function that I was just describing. The earlier treatment doesn't. And it also then, even though it looks bad for when it's initially done, we found that within a year or 2, it tends to regenerate quite quickly. And in some cases, with skilled operators, they can actually even, what we found is that when they pull back that fill material, the old root balls and shrubs are still there, and in some cases they're viable even 10 or 20 years later. And I've seen cases where the equipment operators are literally able to plant the shrub back where it was before that road was built. So the goal here is to return the slope to its original contours, and also then to be sure to treat any stream crossings or culvert issues, and really ripping out the culverts is the best thing. So you often have to dig down to the original stream bed and find those cobbles and pull the soil back so you can reduce the erosion issues. So I have a number of shots. Most of this works on the Clearwater National Forest, where there's basically a collaborative effort between the Nez Perce tribe, the Clearwater National Forest, and then there's also buy-in or cooperation with local labor unions and these machinery operators. So it's an interesting case of what some people call the blue-green coalitions, where the workers and these unions are joining the environmentalists to promote restoration activities and really highlight what some call restoration economies. And this idea of a restoration economy is actually the Western Governors Association, all the governors of Western states have approved a resolution that they'll actively pursue a restoration economy. And it's intended to not just include roads and road removal, but also things like removing obsolete dams that are causing problems or high risk for failure, mine reclamation, a whole suite of sort of aging infrastructures that could be liabilities, but if we turn those into job opportunities, they can actually help revitalize rural communities in some interesting ways. And along those lines, just last month, Congress approved a $39.4 million appropriation for road removal and road treatment, which, depending on what kinds of uses it's applied to, that would amount to as much as 20 or 30,000 miles of roads being removed. So pretty large-scale funding finally coming through for this kind of work. This is sort of right after some treatment. You can see this wasn't a complete recontouring. There's still a little dip where the roadbed had been. And I think this project was intended to be a road to trail conversion. So they kept a little dip in there so that it'd have a sort of flatter area for a hiking trail. This is actually on the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest here in Colorado. And you can see how where the backhoe has been, they're actually fully recontouring that roadbed. Here's a before and after shot. This again is from the Clearwater National Forest. So this road, a year and a half later, looked like this. And I think the key thing, let's see if I can go up. Notice here, the road around that sweep, there's a culvert underneath that curve. So there's a stream flowing underneath the road. And then when they treated it, you can see they dug down to that stream bed so it's able to flow along its natural or its historically occurring channel. And that's really important for not just for erosion purposes, but also for connectivity for fish passage. A lot of the problems with fish is that as culverts erode beneath them, it creates too big a jump, basically, a discontinuity in the stream bed so that fish can't get upriver to spawn. And so this obviously resolves that. This is another full recontour in Idaho where this is a Montana Conservation Corps group coming in. They're carrying straw bales and seedlings to help soften or to help make that scar more absorbent in the first year, really. Because there's often sort of a pulse right after a road is removed where there's this exposed soil that can create some problems. And so if you can treat that, then within a year or two it tends to revegetate pretty well. So just to wrap up and to finish with that third point that I was trying to emphasize, I think it's important for us to recognize that we face choices, really, and we do have, that these are our public lands, and we ought to have, we really do have a say in what kinds of values and what kinds of priorities these lands are managed for. And so for a place like Yellowstone, we face a choice whether we want the primary experience in Yellowstone in winter to be for folks visiting like this on snowmobile, like this in a snowcat or snow coach, or something more like this on skis. And each of those, I think, there are arguments for each of those, but they all lead to very different kinds of management priorities and are expressions of different kinds of values. And so I just want to try to encourage us all to be both active and thoughtful in connecting to these kinds of issues on public lands, and to take part in the opportunities that we have to make your voices heard and to help influence the decisions that are made. And so that's basically all I had to say, but I do want to highlight, and maybe this will help sort of lead off into questions or discussion. The White River National Forest and the Forest Service nationwide is in the process of reevaluating its whole approach to travel management and off-road vehicle management, so that the default use in the past, or the default setting, has been that areas were open unless designated closed. So there had to be a sign basically saying this area is closed, otherwise it was open even for cross-country motorized use. And just in the last year or two, that policy was reversed so that now it's closed unless designated open. So one thing that may do is reduce vandalism of signs, right? Where if you tear down the sign that says it's open, then you've sort of de facto closed your route that you're trying to use. But the other thing that makes a really important opportunity for all of us is to get involved, to contribute to those decisions and those assessments to help the agencies identify which routes we think should be open and which routes should be closed. And I know that I think the scoping phase has been completed for the White River National Forest for that travel planning, but there's still very much, the draft environmental impact statement is due out, what, Dave, in the next few months probably?
Next 2 or 3 months.
Yeah. So it's for those of you in the Roaring Fork Valley, that's a prime opportunity to try to make your voices heard, and I can guarantee you that the motorized constituencies are very well organized around this, and they're trying to get as many routes designated to be open as they can. So if you feel otherwise, it's really important that you represent yourself in that process. So thanks for coming out tonight.
So we've got a few minutes if you guys have any questions for David.
Yeah.
Dave, I was reminded of something I really didn't pursue, but that I noticed years ago, which was that the Forest Service was designing so-called trails even through wilderness, and they seem to be a lot wider than I thought they should be. And I talked to somebody and he said, oh, well, you know, these pack trails, these horses, these panniers need that much width. It's true they need it at pannier height, they don't need it at footprint height. And so I still thought that was all wrong, and they should have maybe trimmed back some bushes or trees where they would interfere with the panniers, but they didn't have to make the whole trail that width. Do you have any comments on that?
It's an interesting point, because if you look at the Forest Service manual, which is their interpretation of their rule, the rules or the laws that are sort of passed to them from Congress, they have a set of specifications for trail width, and I think the narrowest trail width specification, I think it's 18 to 24 inches wide for sort of advanced hiking trails or something, and then it goes on up from there, and but what we're seeing in a lot of places, and especially in the last 5 or 10 years, is trail width. Building specifications have been widening, and I mean, for those of us who are cynical or suspicious or something, I mean, there's one ready explanation that it is to help accommodate the 50-inch tread width of an ATV. I actually have a good friend who's a trail builder up in Bozeman, Montana, and when I've sort of harassed him about, you know, why are you building such wide trails, the explanation he has is that there's sort of a planned degradation of the trail. So they actually overbuild trails with the expectation that in 2 or 3 years, a 50-inch trail will function as a 36-inch trail. But I think a lot of it depends on what kind of use the trails end up receiving. So if that 50-inch trail gets ATV use right from the get-go, it's going to stay a 50-inch wide trail or more. If it's, you know, built to 36 inches and gets only hiking use, it probably is going to degrade. So, but if you look at the funding train or funding stream, there are cases where you can find that ORV groups are working with the state recreation agencies and the Forest Service to make sure that the trails are built wider to accommodate them. So it shouldn't happen in wilderness because they know they can't go in there. But in a lot of the roadless areas that, you know, are part of the Wilderness Workshop's proposal, that's sort of those are the pivotal grounds where it's really important to be vigilant and sort of challenge, I think, land managers about why are you building 50-inch wide trails? How does this match to your specifications in that Forest Service manual? So I think it's important place to be vigilant about.
I work here for the Forest Service.
Okay.
So I can answer a lot
Okay,
of
good.
questions related, especially travel management issues, and I've been very instrumental in closing roads and
Great.
using equipment. And some of these slides are similar to what we've done.
Good.
The only closures that work are going in and ripping the road with heavy equipment. We put up gates and we'll have gates ripped out and so forth. In regards to trail widening, typically easier created. We're not building any trails, we're closing trails, and we're closing roads. Most of the trail construction that goes on out there is illegal bandit construction by mountain bikes, hikers.
On the White River, that's what you're saying.
Yeah. As well as motorized groups. So, I mean, I get quite a bit about it, and I've got a lot of photos. I've been very instrumental in Colby Park and doing some of the road closures. One of our biggest problems we have is we've inherited this huge road system for recreation now. That's our main use, and it wasn't intended for recreation. It's mining, logging, and cattle grazing put in a lot of the road system that we have, as well as some of these, they would blade a cow trail basically to a stock pond that's now heavily used by hikers and bikers. And it was never an official trail, it's sort of de facto become. So we're having a real hard time just keeping a handle on it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that not just the Forest Service, but a lot of the agencies, the multiple-use agencies, BLM and Forest Service, are struggling with is I think we're in the middle sort of a transition from those resource-based economies and uses to really dominant focus on recreation, and recreational impacts are now the main struggle for many languages.
It's huge. And, we don't have, last time we had money for road closures to really rip them with heavy equipment, and it does cost some money, but it's not, it's 1993.
Oh, right.
So,
Yeah.
we haven't done anything since then. We've kind of been waiting for this travel plan. Once that's done, we were going to close in more roads, but it costs money.
It does. On the Clearwater, the average cost per mile is between $10,000 and $15,000 per mile, and those are often pretty small jammer roads.
Right.
In Redwood National Park, where they have these massive, really heavily built roads, it's as much as $500,000 per mile, and so they burn through millions of dollars, taking out a dozen miles of road. So.
The OHV groups, one thing they have working for them, and it's state law in Colorado, in most states, you have to buy an OHV sticker for $30 per
Just
year.
kicks in a fund.
Kicks into a fund, that non-motorized groups typically aren't willing to pay, pay for that.
Yeah.
They're funding like 4 Mile Park here. They've got a huge snowmobile road trail system that's all paid for through the funding. It's used by skiers, for free, and that's fine. But they've got a funding mechanism set up.
Yeah.
The other groups don't.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter in my book about the fund. It's kind of boring, so I don't talk about it, but it's really important to sort of scrutinize how these things are being paid for. So, thanks for coming. You had a question?
If left alone and if access is cut off, can roads just naturally erase themselves eventually?
Well, they can, but that was sort of the point I was trying to emphasize, is that a lot of times these roads that are ignored, if you at the very least, if you need to treat the culverts and the stream crossings, depending on the soils, the whole Rocky Mountain batholith, these granitic soils are just not stable enough. So if you get a heavy rain event, eventually, a lot of people describe them as time bombs. They're waiting out there, and eventually they're going to fail, even if they're pretty overgrown. So that's one of the points I really try to hammer home, is that even if the road looks like it's peaceful and quiet, it may still be just a problem waiting to happen.
And that happens pretty early in the kind of the birth of a road, right? Where if the soil is packed down, then it's packed down for good.
Well, when they build a road, there's a couple different ways of constructing roads, whether you use only the material that you scoop out from the road cut and use that as your fill, or sometimes you haul fill in. But that fill is often, that perched fill is often the trigger point for these slides, because it's not the native soil, so it never can be quite as integrated or as stable as the road cut that's been cut into the hillside. And there are cases where there's roads that have been there for 30 or 40 years and had no failures, and then there's a 10-year rain event, which isn't extraordinary, and there's dozens of failures in the system. So I don't think we totally understand sort of why or when roads fail, but I think what we have seen is that we can't become complacent. We actually do need to treat these roads. I think there's places like those roads in Pitkin Lake that I showed, the flat roads. Those aren't going to go anywhere. So if you're not worried about auxiliary issues, they're not causing erosion problems in places like that. So it really depends on the terrain and the character of the road and the soils. So,
yeah, I went to a really fascinating forum last winter at the Teton Science School. It was a round table on motorized vehicles, and a lot of people showed up. It's a big deal up there. And somebody presented a really fascinating study where they took a fenced-in area of, I don't know how many square miles or whatever, with so many elk and deer in it, and they radio collared all the animals, and then they had a control situation where no one was in there a certain period of time, and then they had this situation where they sent in hikers, in a situation where they sent in mountain bikers, in situations where they sent in road bikes, or motorized bikes. And it was really fascinating to see sort of the scattering of the animals through each of those situations. And that there wasn't a whole lot difference actually between the mountain bikers and the motorbikers at that point, but at least it didn't prove it so well. But the question raised is that when you've got a motorized vehicle out there, the disturbance is the same whether it's one or maybe five, perhaps. It doesn't so much matter if there's one of them out there, or five of them out there. And so then the next question is, well, how much space do you need?
Between?
Well, for one, you know, if you've got one person out there on a snowmobile, how much range does that person need to have a joyful time? And it's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
That's just one.
you raised a couple of different things. That the science on the disturbance effects it isn't totally clear. I think you're right that there have been studies on like bighorn sheep that show elevated heart rates and more stress responses to engine noise and so forth. But there's also studies with snowmobiles where they don't flee as rapidly from snowmobiles as they do from skiers. So it's and I think you can sort of in some of those. If you look at the methodology, it seems like they're different setups, so it may be weighted one way or the other.
Except that you know there was a big difference between a hiker and a mountain biker, basically, and then less of a difference.
Yeah. In terms of that, I mean, I think that your second point is really one of the reasons why there's so many more user conflicts. I think by these ATVs and snowmobiles because they can cover and they need really so much more ground. You can go 30 or 40 or 50 miles in a day on an ATV, whereas you know, even a horse, you almost would never do that, let alone on foot or on skis. So suddenly, you know, 100,000 acres gets a lot smaller if there's machines that are coursing through, you know, vast reaches of it all at once. And then, I'm not sure if this was a point you made, but one other feature of motorized recreation is that they often sort of organize into fun runs, these group activities where you get 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 riders at once where, you know, talk about having your peaceful hike transformed. I mean, if you encounter the fun run when you're out for a backpack or something, it's just a barrage of noise and sound, of noise and smoke. And I think many people feel like it's hazardous to be sort of have this onslaught of motor vehicles come upon them. So all those things I think contribute to the problems with user conflicts.
And that was the question I asked the Blue Ribbon guy that kind of shut him up. Is how much is enough?
And I mean, for me, I feel like that's where some of the linkages between roads and motorized recreation come together. Is when we have these hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, isn't that enough for our motorized access? Like, why do we then need to expand beyond that road system? So in my ideal world, I think I'd say we would eliminate off-road vehicles by virtue of making them stay on roads, which still means there's plenty of places they can go. And granted, they're, you know, whether it's for mending fence lines or search and rescue or, you know, family cruises on a road, there are, I think, appropriate uses for these kinds of machines, but I don't see the need for them to go roaring across ridge lines or across dunes and that kind of thing.
How do they handle it in Yellowstone? They have so many snowmobiles because it's hard for snowmobilers to stay on the road. They can go out in the snow and kick up their rooster tails and just have how do they handle that?
Well, in Yellowstone, the snowmobiles have always been restricted to the paved road system that exists in the summer, and you know there have been cases obviously where people violate that, but in Yellowstone is one of the few places where monitoring and enforcement's been pretty good. There's a ranger staff there that would issue tickets for people who go off road, and one of the things that's come of this whole sort of 8 or 9 year saga in Yellowstone is all snowmobiles now in Yellowstone Park have to be part of a guided trip. So you can no longer go into Yellowstone just on your own in a snowmobile and buzz around. So there is sort of a supervisory role now for those machines.
You go over Beale Pass, you see those
Yeah, and that's really one of the big, I mean, Connie and I were talking this morning about snowmobiles, and you know, even I shared the episode when I was 10 or whatever in snowmobile. It wasn't the same beast that it is today. You know, I think it topped out at about 40 or 50 miles an hour, and it was freezing cold. And you climb on one of them today, and they have heated seats and heated thumb warmers, and they can go 80 or 90 miles an hour. You know, just a regular stock vehicle, and they're lighter, and they have the wider skis, so they can go up. You know, the highest, steepest mountain cirque is no longer off limits to a snowmobile if you're courageous or foolish enough to put it there. So, and it's, I mean, not surprisingly probably that we see more snowmobilers getting killed in avalanches because they can get into these places that they just weren't able to get to 20 years ago.
Were you talking about a 4-mile park or something?
Yeah, that's up past Ski Summit.
Is that, what was
Ski
that
Summit,
like?
yeah, up there. It's a large area of roads and fairly safe riding area.
Well, when you go up to Sunlight, you can take that road all the way. I've been told that road went all the way to Grand Junction, but I don't.
It does.
It does? Long.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the longest snowmobile trails in the country. But it's a road as well. Roads is,
If you've got any more questions, maybe we can come up and ask you individually. But thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was
Thanks y'all for coming. I should also point out Dave Wilderness Workshop has some resources here, and
also, I printed out an op-ed from the New York Times just a couple days ago, Nature Overrun, about motorized vehicle use. And also, we created, just for this show, a little take action sheet if you're interested. Not anything to do right this second, but it talks about our wilderness campaign and the travel management plan process that's going to be coming up in a few months, where you can get involved.
so I also brought a copy of this. This is sort of a, I'll leave it up to you to think what you think about this book, but I have a essay in here, but it's a edited volume. It's really just a tirade against off-road vehicles. So if you want to get your anger up or something, I encourage you to look at this, or if you want to do some curls, it's pretty heavy.
Do you sell it by the pound or by the
It's a good question. I think it's like 5-pound book. And then, not to be too self-promoting, but this is the book that if you are interested in sort of my account of this and sort of the expansion of what I talked about, this is the book. It was published by Island Press, actually in 2002, so it's been out for a few years. But you can get that from Island Press online or from Amazon. So, but this is worth looking at if you're curious. Just there's some pretty amazing shots in there. So, thanks again.
are you familiar with the National OHV rule?
Yeah.
'Cause that's really going to limit.
This is our only home, so treat her with love, with love. We won't be here long, so don't try and hold on to something that belongs.